Alyssa Monroe viewed dating married men less as a moral failing and more as a competitive sport. At 27, she chased the thrill of the hidden text, the hurried, guilt-ridden kiss, and the intoxicating danger of being the secret. Tonight's catch was Nathan Crawford, a successful, newly elected councilman with a wedding band too bright for his casual button-down shirt. The Oakwood Grill in Riverside, California, was the perfect backdrop for their illicit meeting. Dimly lit, expensive, and anonymous enough that everyone was probably too busy tending their own little secrets to notice theirs. "Seriously, I haven't felt this alive since college," Nathan was whispering, leaning across the polished wood of the booth. Alyssa smiled, adjusting the perfect, honey-blonde synthetic hair of her favorite wig. She called her the Siren and took a sip of Pinot Noir. "That's why you call me, isn't it?" Before Nathan could answer, a shadow fell over their table, chilling the air and seeming to flatten the sound of the busy restaurant. "It's why he calls you," yes, a voice said. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient noise like shattered glass. Alyssa looked up. Standing there was a woman who could only be Nathan's wife, Monica. Monica was not weeping, nor was she yelling. She was simply standing, and that was worse than any scene Alyssa could have imagined. Her dress was an immaculate, jet-black silk that absorbed the light. Her eyes, shadowed deep beneath an unervingly smooth forehead, were fixed on Alyssa. But it was her smile that made the blood run cold. It was too wide, too slow, and entirely devoid of human warmth. A mask stretched over something sharp. Nathan, his face instantly white and glistening with cold sweat, scrambled to his feet. "Monica, I can explain." "There is nothing left to explain, Nathan," Monica replied, her voice soft and entirely reasonable. She didn't spare him a glance. Her focus remained purely, sickeningly on Alyssa. Alyssa felt a sudden, profound spike of fear, recognizing that she was witnessing a horror far beyond a domestic squabble. This woman wasn't just angry. She was changed. Monica took one deliberate step closer to the booth, her gaze sweeping over Alyssa. "You're wearing someone else's hair. How appropriate." Then she reached out. Her hand, bone white and thin, moved slowly toward Alyssa's shoulder. Alyssa recoiled, but not fast enough. The woman's fingertips brushed the silk sleeve of Alyssa's blouse, just above her elbow. The touch wasn't hot, but intensely, profoundly cold. A chilling, invasive 0-degree poison. A searing, phantom pain erupted across Alyssa's arm, but when she looked down, there was no mark. Instead, her vision suddenly warped. The linen tablecloth seemed to peel away from the wood beneath it like wet paint. The noise of the restaurant shifted. The low hum of conversation didn't stop, but dozens of female voices, thin and sharp like needles, began whispering a single, accusatory chorus in her ear. "He promised me. I gave him everything. You knew. Alyssa gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She looked at Nathan, who was now babbling into his phone, trying to call the manager or the police, his panic a futile, buzzing sound. When she looked back at Monica, the woman's smile had widened even further, pulling the skin taut across her cheekbones. The whispering chorus of women swelled into a hysterical shriek that only Alyssa could hear. She saw Nathan's face begin to shimmer, his skin turning a sickly, translucent yellow, bubbling as if it were melting wax. Then, the true horror began. Alyssa felt a frantic tug at the back of her head. She reached up, confused, and felt the synthetic fiber of her wig, the siren, writhing beneath her fingers. In the reflection of her wine glass, she saw the hair move. It wasn't a product of the chill. The strands were actively coiling, separating from the cap, and twisting like tiny, blonde snakes. "The ruin we wear," Monica's calm voice said, sounding suddenly closer, though the woman hadn't moved. "It always begins with the vanity." Alyssa stumbled out of the booth, knocking her chair over. She saw her reflection flash in a nearby, framed photograph on the wall. For a split second, the reflection wasn't hers. It was a hollow-eyed woman with gray, peeling skin, weeping tears of black oil. And behind the weeping phantom, standing patiently with that inhuman smile, was Monica. The whispering voices, the chorus of the betrayed, were now loudest of all, speaking directly in her mind, not her ears. She is the collector. And now you are collected. The police arrived then. 2 officers, Officer Hayes and Officer Jensen, separated Monica and Nathan. Nathan was hysterical, pointing at Alyssa and babbling about hallucinations. Monica, however, was cooperative and eerily serene. As they led Monica out, her eyes caught Alyssa's one last time. She didn't speak, but the chorus of internal voices boomed. "I am the memory you cannot escape, Alyssa Monroe. You will see me in every lie you tell yourself." Alyssa was taken to a local hospital and given a clean bill of health. Officer Hayes told her that Monica Crawford was being booked on charges of assault and disturbing the peace, pending a psychological evaluation. "She's in custody, Ms. Monroe," the officer reassured her gently. "She can't hurt you." But later that night, back in the dubious safety of her apartment, Alyssa knew that was a lie. She tore off the siren wig and threw it onto the bathroom floor, running her hands through her naturally short, dark hair. She splash-washed her face, trying to scrub away the lingering psychic chill of Monica's touch. When she looked up at her bathroom mirror, the horror returned. Her reflection was there, but subtly wrong. The shadow beneath her jaw was too deep, the corners of her eyes too sharp, and her mouth was set in that slow, terrifying smile. And standing just behind her own reflection, partially obscured by the edge of the mirror frame, was Monica. She was in an identical black dress, just watching. Alyssa screamed and slammed the bathroom door shut. She didn't open it for an hour, sitting on the floor, curled up, listening to the silence. But the silence didn't last. She heard a dry, faint scraping sound coming from the bathroom, followed by a repetitive, soft thump, thump, thump. She crept back, heart hammering. She slid the door open, just a crack. The wig, the siren, was on the floor, but it wasn't still. It was inching across the tile, dragging itself toward the mirror. The synthetic strands had woven themselves into tight, coarse bundles, resembling nerve clusters or thin, pale fingers, propelling the cap forward. The thumping sound was the hollow dome of the cap hitting the ground as it moved. And in the mirror, Monica was no longer partially obscured. She stood directly behind Alyssa's reflection, raising a hand. As Monica's reflection's hand rose, so did Alyssa's reflection's hand, placing a terrifying, proprietorial grip on her own reflected shoulder. Alyssa's reflected face twisted in pure agony, and the skin on her reflected cheek began to ripple and peel, exactly as Nathan's had seemed to do in the restaurant. A single, dark crack, like a vein of granite, appeared in the glass of the mirror, radiating from where Monica's reflection was touching Alyssa's. The voices of the betrayed women returned, a loud, echoing chant in the small, tiled room. "She gave us the key. She gave us the key." Alyssa scrambled backward into the hallway, collapsing against the wall. She watched, paralyzed, as the crawling wig reached the mirror and the blonde, fibrous snakes of hair pressed against the glass. The mirror's crack deepened, spiderwebbing out, turning the glass surface into a swirling, liquid portal. Monica's reflection stepped forward, out of Alyssa's reflection, becoming the sole figure in the glass. The air suddenly smelled of dust and ancient regret. "The door is open," Monica whispered, though her lips didn't move. The wig on the floor launched itself, not toward Alyssa, but toward the mirror. It zipped through the cracking portal, disappearing into the dark, swirling void on the other side. Alyssa's own reflection then shifted. It was no longer her, but a horrifying composite. A woman with her face, but with the eyes of 1,000 weeping strangers and skin that looked dry, brittle, and ready to shed. This new reflection reached a hand out from the mirror, and the glass, now soft and pliable like oil, slid over its fingers. Then the reflection spoke, not with Monica's voice, but with Alyssa's own voice, tortured and resigned. "You will wear our ruin." The air tightened, the pressure intense. Alyssa felt a sudden, sharp constriction around her neck. She looked down and saw a strand of blonde hair, identical to the wig's, coiling around her throat, impossibly tight, burning with the same 0-degree chill of Monica's touch. It wasn't a hallucination. The hair was real, impossibly strong, tightening just enough to maintain constant, suffocating pain, a perpetual reminder. Alyssa Monroe never went back to the police. She couldn't. She knows the truth now. Monica wasn't arrested. Monica is not a person. She is a vessel, a collective of all the women she betrayed. And now Alyssa is one of the collected. Every morning, her reflection is slightly more decayed, the smile slightly wider. The blonde strand around her throat never loosens. And in every polished surface, every pane of glass, every mirror she glances at, Monica waits, serene and silent, ready to welcome her deeper into the eternal haunting. Alyssa is trapped, forever listening to the chorus of whispering, betrayed voices demanding, "You will wear our ruin, and the thrill you sought will be the stone you carry." A quick announcement here. If you're still here and enjoying these stories but haven't subscribed yet, please take a second to do so. Drop a comment too. It really helps push the video out to more people. Your support means everything, and it truly makes my day. Cara, at 31, was tired of the silence in her Norfolk apartment. The loneliness that had settled in after her last relationship dissolved was thick and suffocating, making her usually organized life as a paralegal feel gray and meaningless. She finally worked up the courage to reactivate her dating profile, seeking not a grand romance, but a simple connection, a warm hand in the dark. That connection arrived in the form of Evan Wright, a middle school history teacher with a kind, unassuming face and eyes the gentle blue of worn denim. Their first meeting was set for a Friday evening at the Shipyard Tavern, a cozy, dimly lit establishment near the naval base, known for its strong cocktails and exposed brick. The date started beautifully. Evan was easy to talk to, discussing everything from the nuances of the American Civil War to his slightly embarrassing obsession with baking sourdough bread. Cara found herself laughing, a genuine, unrestrained sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. For the first time in what felt like forever, the suffocating grayness of her life seemed to lift, replaced by the soft amber glow of the tavern's light and the genuine hope Evan offered. They were seated in a small booth by the window, occasionally catching the glint of the distant harbor lights. It was during Evan's anecdote about a particularly disastrous attempt at a rye loaf that Cara felt the shift. It was a pressure, a sudden, cold awareness that someone was watching her. She glanced across the room, toward the long, polished mahogany bar. Seated alone on a stool was a man who immediately felt out of place. He was gaunt, with an impossibly high hairline, and his clothes, a severe, high-collared tweed suit and a bowler hat resting beside him, looked heavy and dark, as if they had been tailored for the 1890s rather than modern Virginia. His stillness was what was truly unsettling. He wasn't drinking or speaking to anyone. He was simply facing the booth, his eyes, dark and flat, pinned solely on Kara. She shivered, momentarily forgetting Evan's story. "Everything all right, Kara?" Evan asked, noting her distraction. "Yes, fine," she murmured, forcing a smile. "Just the drafts in this old place." But when she looked back, the man hadn't moved, yet his lips were moving. The bar was too loud for her to hear anything, but the way his mouth shaped the syllables was deliberate and slow. She could read it, plain as if he were shouting, "C-R-A." He was whispering her name, a name he could not possibly know, given that Evan had only ever referred to her as Kara, and they had just been introduced moments ago. The whisper wasn't audible, yet vibrated in the deepest recess of her inner ear, a phantom sound promising cold malice. She turned her attention back to Evan with frantic intensity, but the knowledge that those empty, ancient eyes were still on her made every word catch in her throat. They decided to leave shortly after. The atmosphere in the tavern, once warm, now felt suffocating and charged. Evan, sensing her discomfort, offered his coat, but Kara declined. The night air was thick and damp, promising the imminent downpour that often plagued Norfolk. "I had a really wonderful time, Evan," Kara said, managing a shaky smile as they reached the tavern's exterior, a narrow, shadowed lane lit by a single, flickering gas lamp. "Me too, Kara. I'd love to." He stopped abruptly, his kind face draining of color. Kara followed his gaze. The man from the bar was waiting for them. He stood directly beneath the flickering lamp, and despite the warmth of the evening, she could see a faint mist of condensation around him. He hadn't just walked out. He seemed to have materialized like a memory given substance. He took a slow step forward, his tweed suit entirely unrumpled. "You can't leave us, Kara. Not again." His voice, now audible, was thin and reedy, like a forgotten musical instrument. It carried the musty scent of ancient documents and stagnant water. Evan, normally so calm, reacted with sudden animal terror. "Who is that? Do you know him?" he stammered, grabbing Kara's wrist. "I swear I don't," Kara insisted, pulling away. The man's words, "not again," struck her with a bizarre sense of recognition, like a long-dormant trauma trying to surface. The ancient man smiled, and it wasn't the menacing smile of Monica, but something infinitely older and sadder, filled with the knowledge of irreversible loss. "You promised, dear. You made us promises in the water." As if triggered by his words, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, pattering loudly against the pavement. From the surrounding alleyways and the dark gaps between the parked cars, shapes began to coalesce. They were indistinct at first, shadows denser than the night, but as the rain intensified, they gained form. They were the size and shape of human figures, yet they lacked definition. They looked less like people and more like figures sketched in charcoal on wet paper, moving with a jerky, relentless hunger. They made no noise, save for the rhythmic sloshing of their sodden clothing, a sound that amplified terrifyingly in the sudden downpour. They were soaked, dripping, and they were approaching. "Get in the car now," Evan screamed, shoving Kara toward his modest, charcoal gray sedan parked a few yards away. They scrambled inside. Evan fumbled with the key, his hands visibly shaking as the figures quickened their pace. Kara looked out the rear window. The tweed-suited man stood at the center of the gathering crowd, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze patiently fixed on them. The engine finally roared to life. Evan slammed the accelerator, tires squealing against the wet asphalt. As they sped away, Kara glanced frantically at the side mirror. The figures were chasing the car, moving with impossible speed and silence. One of them, its features momentarily sharpened by a flash of lightning, pressed its pale, distorted face against the rear window, leaving a smear of dirty water that looked unnervingly like a weeping eye. Evan was hyperventilating, steering erratically through the slick streets of downtown Norfolk. What was that? What were they? They know you, Kara. They said you can't leave them. I don't know, Kara shouted back, burying her face in her hands, trying to stifle a rising, hysterical sob. I swear I don't remember them. She looked over at Evan, hoping to find some shared anchor in the insanity, but his eyes were wide, vacant, staring straight ahead as if he were already seeing the end. He drove them directly to her apartment complex, pulling into the underground parking garage with reckless speed. Go. Just go. He choked out, his voice a ragged whisper. I can't be near you. He didn't wait for a response. The second Kara had unbuckled her seatbelt, he threw the gear into reverse, slamming the door behind her. She stood there, dripping and stunned, watching his tail lights vanish into the darkness of the garage. Evan Wright disappeared from her life completely that night, not just from the garage, but from existence. The next morning, Kara's first panicked act was to check the dating app. Evan's profile was gone, not deactivated, but erased. She checked his workplace, the local middle school where he taught history. When she called, they insisted no one named Evan Wright had ever been on staff. His email address was invalid. His social media vanished. He was a phantom, the kind teacher and sourdough baker who had spent 2 hours with her in a public tavern, now wiped from all digital and civic records. The haunting began subtly. It was restricted to the storms. When the torrential Virginia rain lashed against her bedroom window, she would hear it, a faint, communal whisper, a sibilant hiss that repeated her name. Kara, Kara, Kara. She would rush to the window and peer through the streaming glass. They were always there, groups of them. They stood silently on the narrow strip of lawn between her building and the road, unmoving, unnervingly still in the furious downpour. They were the same soaked, shadowy figures from the street, and though the rain streamed down their dark, heavy clothes and plastered their hair to their foreheads, they never seemed to flinch or shiver. They simply stood like statues carved from granite and drenched in sorrow. One night, during a particularly violent electrical storm, she saw the tweed-suited man standing closer to the building than the others. She could feel his focus. It bypassed the glass, the brick, and the insulation, piercing directly into her mind. The whisper wasn't in the air outside. It was inside her skull, cold and demanding. You belong in the cold, beloved. We are waiting for you to honor the promise. The terror wasn't just in the sight of the dead. It was in the gnawing, inexplicable sense of familiarity. Why did she feel like she should know them? She tried to find confirmation. She drove back to the Shipyard Tavern. The bartender, a burly man named Gus whom she remembered clearly, served her a drink. I was here last Friday, Kara said, her voice shaking slightly. I was with a man, Evan Wright, at the booth by the window. Gus gave her a blank look. Nope. Been here all night, every night. Just you at the window booth last Friday, doll. You were sipping wine, reading a book, and left about 9. The gaslighting was total, absolute. Evan Wright was a ghost, an elaborate mental construct designed to lure her out. Or perhaps, a very real man erased by the supernatural entity she had encountered. As the storms became more frequent, so did the whispering. Kara began to develop flashes of memory, disjointed and terrifying. A wooden pier, the smell of brine, a long white dress, a desperate pledge made while standing ankle-deep in the cold, swirling water of the bay. She saw herself, younger, thinner, making a vow to them, to the collective of the drowned, the forgotten, the promised. The realization hit her like a physical blow during a hurricane-level storm one late October night. The figures were outside, standing on the grass, their forms vibrating with the force of the wind. She wasn't just being haunted by them. She had once been one of them. She had somehow left their world, perhaps cheated death, or been pulled back by some desperate attempt to live a normal life. But the promises made in the grave are never truly broken. The rain was their connection, the storm their door. Every drop of water was a tiny messenger, bringing them closer, reminding her of the cold, eternal marriage she had tried to escape. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, staring into the distorted, rain-slicked faces. They were sad, yes, but they were also relieved, like long-lost friends finally reunited. The whispers in her head intensified, no longer accusatory, but welcoming. "It is time to return, Kara. You have had your time. Come home. Come home to the cold." She was trapped, listening to the drumming rain, knowing that the figures outside weren't trying to scare her. They were just waiting patiently for her to remember where she truly belonged. The next storm would not be a mere visit. It would be the reclamation. And Kara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that when the sun rose, she would be gone, and Evan Wright would not be the only one erased from the records. She would be standing among the sodden figures, silent, waiting for the next lonely soul to break a promise to the depths. Clara Hastings had returned to Savannah not by choice, but by wreckage. Her engagement to a man she'd known since childhood had imploded 6 weeks prior, leaving her 22 years old and feeling ancient. She moved back into her grandmother's quiet carriage house, seeking the familiar comfort of the city's Spanish moss and humid, timeless beauty. It was 1998, and the pervasive stillness of the humid air seemed to amplify her isolation. She had agreed to the date with Ethan Mercer only to prove to her friends and to herself that she wasn't hiding. Ethan was an architecture student who looked as meticulously curated as the historic buildings he studied. They met at an antique shop on Jones Street. Ethan claimed the best first dates involved finding a relic that somehow reflected your soul. The air inside the shop was thick with dust and the scent of lemon oil. As they moved through rows of distressed mahogany and tarnished silver, Clara caught sight of herself in an enormous, gilt-edged floor mirror. She was wearing a simple, deep red silk blouse, a reckless choice, considering she was trying to project a sense of cautious recovery. Her reflection smiled back, but something about the motion was delayed, distorted. Clara paused, rubbing her eyes. When she looked again, her reflection was perfectly still, staring back with an unervingly patient expression, as if it had only just caught up with her movements. She shook it off as a stress and poor lighting. But a few aisles later, she found a tiny, handheld mirror, the silver plating flaked away at the edges, the glass cloudy with age. As she held it up, her reflection in the small piece of glass twitched, just the corner of the lip moving before she did. It was a subtle, malicious tick. She felt a cold pinprick on the back of her neck. "Find anything?" Ethan asked, his voice low and cultured. Clara quickly placed the small mirror into her antique handbag. "Just a piece I felt I had to have." She tried to focus on Ethan as they made their way toward Leopold's, the iconic ice cream parlor and restaurant. The streets were quiet, the moss dripping silently from the oaks. She was determined to have a normal evening, but the unsettling feeling persisted, making her skin crawl. Leopold's was bustling, yet when they were seated near a wall of vintage, rippled glass panels, the noise seemed to dim around them. The panels acted like imperfect mirrors, distorting the light and the movements of the diners. As they waited for their dessert, Clara caught her distorted image in the nearest glass panel. This time, the reflection was horrifying. It wasn't just moving on its own, it was wrong. Her reflection was a grotesque doppelganger, its face covered in gray, peeling decay, its eyes sunken and milky white. It looked like a corpse that had been submerged for a century, forced to wear her red blouse. The horror had a name, and it was her own. The reflected Clara smiled, that wide, unnatural smile, and brought a skeletal hand up to press against the glass. The glass panel rippled, not like water, but like disturbed oil, the movement traveling outward from the point of contact. Clara gasped, pulling her hand away from the table. Ethan leaned in, his own face suddenly pale with undisguised fear, his architectural precision replaced by ragged terror. "Don't look at the mirrors, Clara," he whispered fiercely, his eyes darting around the room, fearful of drawing attention. "They notice when you do. They're starved. What are you talking about?" "Look," Clara pointed frantically at the panel, but the decay was already receding, leaving only the slightly warped image of her horrified, living face. Ethan didn't look. He kept his gaze fixed on the tablecloth. "The mirrors here, in Savannah, they are thin doors. They're old, hungry. They were put up to reflect the city's wealth, but they collect its debts. And yours. My debts? I don't understand. Your broken promise," Ethan hissed, the urgency of his voice barely contained. "The promise you broke when you left him, when you decided to start fresh." They heard that vow, Clara. They collect promises and the pain they cause. Just then, two shadows, dark and thin as broken shards of glass, detached themselves from the rippling reflections in a neighboring panel. They weren't solid. They were merely the absence of light, yet they moved with purpose. The shadows converged on Clara, and as they swept over her, a torrent of whispers filled her ears, though no one else seemed to notice. "You said forever. You walked away clean. We are the price." The whispers were the collective voices of all the vows and commitments the mirrors had collected. As the shadows passed, Clara felt a physical chill, a terrible weakness, as if a layer of her vitality had been peeled away. Ethan grabbed her hand, his eyes desperate. "We need to leave now. They get hungry when they see color, Clara. Especially red. It's too much life, too much blood." She looked down at her beautiful, vibrant red blouse. It felt suddenly heavy, radiating a heat that wasn't warm, but feverish. She realized her choice of clothing hadn't been an act of recovery. It had been an unconscious beacon, a flashing sign of life and promise for the things behind the glass. They left Leopold's in a terrifying rush. Ethan, looking utterly destroyed, drove her straight back to the carriage house. He refused to come inside, simply repeating his frantic warnings. "Change that blouse. Don't look in the glass. Ever. Don't give them a complete picture of what they want." Clara locked the door behind her and stumbled into her bedroom. She avoided the full-length mirror, heading straight for the bathroom to splash cold water on her face. When she looked up into the medicine cabinet mirror, she gasped. The glass wasn't broken, but smeared with grime. Not ordinary dirt, but something dark and thick. And imprinted on the smear were 4 distinct, wet handprints. Just below them, etched into the glass as if by a diamond, was a single, terrifying word: soon. She backed away, stumbling into the bedroom. Her reflection in the dresser mirror was her normal face, but began to melt, replaced by a swift sequence of images. A terrified man being pulled backward into a silvered surface. A woman's face screaming silently as dust consumed her hair. And finally, her own decayed, rotten doppelganger, laughing soundlessly. They're trading places. Ethan's voice rasped, the sound coming from her phone receiver as he called her immediately after leaving. They showed you a vision of their treasury, the people they've taken to become the collectors. They're trying to tempt your reflection into taking your place. The wig, the hair, It was moving in the glass, Clara whimpered, looking over at the small hand mirror she had bought. That's the key. That small mirror is their doorway, and your reflection knows it. Your reflection wants out, Clara. It wants to stop being a debt collector and become the life it was meant to be. Clara watched, frozen by the phone, as the reflection in the dresser mirror lifted its hand again. This time, it wasn't decayed, but perfect. Her face, her vibrant, living self. The reflection brought its hand to the surface of the glass, placing its palm flat against the thin, deceptive barrier. She stared, paralyzed by an ancient, debilitating fear. She knew that one day, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps tonight, she would blink or turn her back for a second too long. And when she looked again, she would see nothing but an empty room. Because her perfect, living reflection, wearing the tempting red blouse, would finally have stepped out, leaving Clara trapped, a terrified, hungry new collector behind the glass. Camille Hart, a 27-year-old medical assistant, had moved to Clearwater, Florida, hoping the pervasive sunlight would counteract the persistent emotional chill of her recent solitude. She was lonely, yes, but her life was ordered. Shifts at the clinic, beach walks, and endless streaming. A friend from her previous job, Tasha, insisted on fixing her up. He's my cousin, Nolan, Tasha had promised. He's sweet, stable, and needs to meet someone normal like you. The blind date was set for a trendy fusion restaurant near the waterfront, a place where the bright, sterile white decor seemed to amplify every sound. Nolan was instantly charming, handsome, with an easy, confident smile, and he spoke passionately about marine biology. Camille felt herself relaxing, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. But as the dinner progressed, small, disquieting details began to accumulate. The light fixtures were highly polished chrome, and whenever Camille looked at the distorted reflections, she noticed something disturbing. Nolan's image would lag behind his movements a millisecond behind, creating a visual stutter. Even more unnerving was her water glass. The liquid looked crystal clear, yet with every sip, Camille tasted a faint, stinging metallic flavor, like static electricity or old pennies dissolved in water. She excused it as an issue with the restaurant's plumbing, but the taste lingered, coating her tongue. "Is everything okay with your drink?" Nolan asked, catching her eye. His own glass of water remained untouched. "Just a funny taste," Camille said, forcing a smile. Nolan's smile, however, seemed strangely fixed for a beat too long. "Maybe we need some fresh air. The water here is never quite right. I know a quiet spot on the beach." It was nearly 10 o'clock when they arrived at Clearwater Beach. The air was heavy and thick with moisture, the ocean a massive, whispering darkness. They walked toward the dunes, the white sand cool beneath their shoes. Camille felt a sense of peace finally settle over her, driving away the unsettling reflections and the metallic taste. Nolan stopped and turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. He didn't ask permission. He simply reached out and gripped her wrist, firmly, possessively. The moment his fingers closed around her pulse point, the world changed. A sound, deep and pervasive, rose around them. It wasn't a natural sound like the ocean or the wind. It was a mechanical, resonant hum that seemed to originate not from the environment, but from within her own body. It vibrated deep in her bones, synchronizing unsettlingly with her own rapid heartbeat, a low, powerful frequency that threatened to shake her apart from the inside. The air felt heavy, viscous, and the few distant lights along the coastline seemed to flicker and dim in time with the resonant sound. "Can you hear that?" Camille whispered, terrified, trying to pull her arm away. Nolan's eyes, fixed on hers, were no longer the gentle blue she remembered from the restaurant. They were dark, reflective, and utterly empty. "Listen closely, Camille," he murmured, his voice now deep and hollow, distorted by the pervasive hum. "It's the sound of the structure, the sound of everything connecting." He tightened his grip, and the hum intensified to a painful, deafening shriek inside her head, flooding her with an overwhelming sense of cosmic loneliness and cold, dark purpose. Camille felt herself spiraling, her reality tearing at the seams. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the moment shattered. "Hey, everything all right over here?" A cheerful, middle-aged couple, walking a small terrier, rounded the dune. They were laughing easily, their presence cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like clean air. Nolan instantly released Camille's wrist. The hum dropped back down to a distant, almost inaudible throb, and the normal sounds of the beach, the distant waves, the dogs yapping, returned. Camille blinked, disoriented, rubbing the still tingling imprint of his fingers on her wrist. She turned to Nolan to explain what happened, but Nolan was gone. He wasn't running. He was simply absent. The sand where he had stood was smooth, undisturbed. The couple, oblivious, gave her a friendly wave and moved on. Camille stood alone on the dark beach, heart pounding, convinced she had suffered a sudden, severe break from reality. She raced home, frantic, her first thought to call Tasha. But first, she had to check the evidence. She scrolled through her phone. The contact entry for Nolan was gone. The texts they had exchanged confirming the date were erased. Even the geotag from the restaurant photo she had taken of her appetizer was scrubbed. All digital evidence of Evan Wright's existence had been systematically obliterated. The next day, Tasha answered her frantic call with genuine confusion. "Nolan? I don't have a cousin named Nolan. Are you sure you haven't just been working too many double shifts?" The gaslighting was total, but Camille knew what was real because the hum returned. Every night, precisely when the sun dipped below the horizon, the low, mechanical resonance would start, vibrating the floorboards of her apartment and settling in her chest. It was a constant reminder of Nolan's touch. During the day, she received texts from an unknown, untraceable number. Don't doubt what's real. The doubt is the cage. Desperate and unable to sleep, Camille sought help. She found an anchor in a kind social worker named Eli, who specialized in trauma and dissociation. Eli didn't dismiss her. He listened patiently, his warm, empathetic eyes giving her a fragile sense of validation. When she was with Eli, discussing her fear, the hum would weaken to a distant memory, almost vanishing, though it never fully disappeared. He represented hope, logic, and the return to her normal, lonely, but safe life. Months passed. Camille stabilized, keeping Eli close, relying on his grounded presence. She had a roommate, a fellow nurse named Denise, whose presence seemed to keep the strange texts and the hum at bay during the day. Then, Denise left town for a week-long convention. The moment the key turned in the lock, locking the empty apartment, the hum roared back to life, louder than it had been since the beach. Nolan materialized in her living room. He was simply standing there, as if he had never left, dressed in the exact clothes from their first date. He looked slightly disappointed, but not angry. "Hello, Camille," he said, his voice now fully resonant with the humming frequency. "You chose to doubt. That was wise, but you cannot choose loneliness over truth forever." Camille backed away until she hit the wall, utterly terrified. "Eli is a comfort," Nolan continued, stepping closer. "A distraction, but I offer you a world without loneliness. I offer you the understanding of the hum, the structure of reality we access. You fell on the beach. Now you must choose." He extended his hand, his eyes shimmering with the reflection she had first seen in the restaurant. Truth is the only door. Choose Eli, and you choose a fragile, isolated hope. Choose me, and you choose a terrifying, beautiful connection that is eternal. Camille forced herself to choke out the rejection, choosing the safety of doubt and isolation. I reject you. Get out. Nolan smiled, the same fixed, reflective expression. You will never escape the choice, Camille. He dissolved, leaving only the ringing hum in his wake. Camille spent the next few weeks glued to Eli, sobbing out the horror. Eli comforted her, his steady presence and anchor. The hum lingered, low and constant, but she learned to filter it out. She felt she had survived. One evening, while Eli was talking about her recovery, Camille caught their reflection in the window overlooking the city lights. She saw herself, tired but alive, and Eli, reassuring and kind. But then the reflection shifted. Eli's eyes were momentarily vacant and dark, capturing the light like a perfect black mirror. The terrifying, reflective eyes of Nolan. The image lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was long enough. Camille realized she hadn't made a choice between Nolan and Eli. She had simply chosen one flavor of the hum over another, and the truth of the structure had merely changed vessels. Eli continued to speak, gentle and warm, but in the back of Camille's mind, the hum persisted, and she was left in the paralyzing, eternal uncertainty of not knowing which man, the comforting savior or the terrifying predator, was truly real. Aaron, at 26, had built his quiet world within the hallowed, high-ceilinged quiet of the Brookfield Public Library. He was a librarian, a custodian of silence and history, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of cataloging and the dry, papery smell of aging knowledge. He felt the library was an extension of the city itself, a structure of stone, memory, and quiet commitment. His life, however, was marked by an absence of meaningful connection, a constant, low-level ache of loneliness. That absence was violently interrupted one Tuesday afternoon when a man approached the reference desk asking for access to the restricted city archives. His name was Victor. Victor was immediately unsettling. He wore an immaculate, dark three-piece suit that seemed too heavy for the season, and his face was angular, almost chiseled, framed by unnaturally graying hair. The most disturbing detail, however, was his hands. As he leaned on the marble counter, Aaron noticed that Victor's fingernails were not merely unkempt. They were fissured, cracked, and strangely pale, like ancient, fractured stone. The old city records, Victor requested, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate the glass display case behind Aaron. Specifically, the architectural plans for the 1890 water main tunnels. Stone remembers where the water runs. Aaron was halfway through looking up the request when the first anomaly occurred. The overhead fluorescent lights, usually providing a steady, sterile glow, began to hum. Not the gentle, administrative buzz common in old buildings, but a deep, vibrating chord that seemed to emanate from the foundation of the library itself. When Aaron looked away for Victor to check the lights, he glanced at the nearby new arrival shelf. The books there had rearranged themselves. The spines, dark blue and gray, were now aligned to spell a single, unmistakable word, Aaron. He spun back to the counter, heart hammering. Victor was smiling, his lips thin and dry. The building is quite sensitive to new energies, isn't it? He said, as if referring to a mild air current. He collected the archive request card, his cracked fingers brushing Aaron's. The contact felt shockingly cold, like touching granite in midwinter. You belong here, Aaron. The stone remembers you, too, Victor murmured, his dark eyes holding a geological depth. You are part of its commitment. Aaron spent the rest of the week reeling, attributing the events to exhaustion and overwork. Then, he met Daniel. Daniel was the opposite of Victor. Warm, bright-eyed, and entirely normal. He was an old crush from university, now back in town. And when he stopped by the library to say hello, Aaron felt a rush of genuine, uncomplicated relief. They talked easily, deciding on an actual first date, dinner on Saturday. But the library resisted this normal hope. As Aaron walked Daniel out, he passed the history section. On a prominent end cap display, a book titled A City Under Stone had inexplicably fallen open. Scribbled across the first page in archaic, heavy script were the words, "Don't trust him. He wears two faces for the sleeping." Aaron felt a terrible chill. The warning was specific, personal, and utterly illogical. Daniel was friendly, human, and excited about their date. He wasn't Victor. Yet, Victor was everywhere. That Friday night, Aaron arrived home to his apartment, finding the front door slightly ajar. He searched every room, finding nothing stolen, no sign of forced entry. But in the center of his living room carpet, where he never walked, was a small, almost imperceptible pile of gray, gritty residue. Fine stone dust, the color of crushed limestone. Victor had been inside, claiming the space, marking the territory. The horror intensified when he realized the hum from the library was now following him. It didn't just happen when Victor was near. It was a constant, low frequency that only he could hear, especially when Daniel was texting him. The hum was an invisible current running between the three of them: Aaron, Daniel, and the predatory echo of Victor. Driven by a desperation that transcended professional curiosity, Aaron finally accessed the archives Victor had requested. He didn't find the water plans. Instead, buried deep in a fragile folder of 19th century city establishment records, he found a photograph. It was a formal portrait of the city council from 1892, seated prominently among them. His expression severe and unchanged was Victor. The exact suit, the exact hairline, the exact same face. Victor was not merely old. He was timeless, a piece of the city's bedrock given human form. The accompanying text spoke of a commitment, an agreement made between the city founders and a patron of the foundation to ensure the permanence of the city's memory, binding certain citizens to the stone structure itself. Aaron understood then. The first date with Victor wasn't a meeting, it was an activation. Victor was an ancient warden, a soul bound to the city's very architecture, existing only to collect new memories, new permanent residents. His mind flashed to Daniel, his kind eyes and gentle laugh. Daniel was too perfect, too easy. He was the human facade, the attractive bait Victor used to lure the lonely. The two faces for the sleeping the book had warned about. The relief Aaron had felt in Daniel's presence was simply the warmth of the lure, designed to make the transition less painful. He looked down at his hands, suddenly aware of a painful stiffness in his fingers. The hum in the air peaked into a grating crescendo. He stared at his fingernails. Across the smooth white of his thumb, a tiny, jagged fissure had appeared, a fine, hairline crack running from the cuticle upward. It was pale, gritty, and unmistakably stone. The transformation had begun. He was no longer Aaron, the librarian. He was becoming a part of the city's eternal, static memory, claimed by the entity he had mistaken for a date. The city was sinking its roots into him, layer by layer, turning bone to calcium and flesh to the mortar of time. He was trapped in the structure, forever committed to the stone, the voices of Victor and Daniel echoing in his ears as one. "You belong here, Aaron. You will be remembered forever. In 2017, Vanessa Calloway lived a life dictated by the Dewey Decimal System. At 26, her world revolved around the quiet, air-conditioned sanctity of the Franklin Park Branch Library in Columbus, Ohio. Her friend, Eliza, had decided this life was too sedate and insisted on a blind date. "He's perfect, Vanessa," Eliza had enthused. A real estate developer named Victor Hale. Charming, educated, and not a library book in sight. The date was at Sycamore, a chic, exposed brick restaurant in German Village. Victor Hale was terrifyingly exactly as Eliza had promised, unervingly perfect. He possessed the kind of tailored confidence that felt less earned and more inherent. His suit immaculate, his conversation flowing smoothly from city planning to Baroque art. He laughed at her quiet, librarian jokes. He remembered her drink order, and he listened with an intense, unblinking focus that made Vanessa feel simultaneously seen and scrutinized. Yet, that unnerving perfection held a flaw. When Victor reached across the table to gesture, Vanessa noticed his hands. His nails were not clean or manicured. They were rough, pale, and fissured, crisscrossed with tiny, dark lines that looked less like dirt and more like cracks in aging stone or dried earth. "Long day at the construction site?" Vanessa asked lightly, trying to ignore the prickle of unease. Victor simply smiled, a smooth, quick movement that didn't quite reach his dark eyes. "I handle old foundations," he replied. "They tend to cling to you." During a trip to the restroom, the true horror began. Vanessa checked her appearance in the restroom mirror, a large, unframed sheet of polished glass. She adjusted her hair, still smiling slightly at the thought of Victor's effortless charm. But as she watched her reflection, she saw Victor appear in the glass behind her. He wasn't standing at the door. He was just there, a shadow figure in the mirrored space, leaning toward her. His lips were moving silently, forming a single, possessive word that seemed to absorb the light. "Mine." Vanessa spun around, her heart vaulting into her throat. The restroom was empty. Shaking, she returned to the table. Victor was calmly scrolling through his phone, looking completely undisturbed. "Everything all right?" he asked, looking up. "Just a bit tired," she lied, the metallic taste of fear sharp on her tongue. The date ended shortly after. Victor insisted on driving her home. As they pulled up to her quiet apartment complex, he stopped the car. The atmosphere shifted instantly from charming to claustrophobic. "The night is still young. Vanessa," Victor murmured, leaning in. Vanessa felt a paralyzing sense of danger, the primal urge to flee overwhelming the manufactured charm. She reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't move. The central locking system was engaged, and the familiar electric thunk was replaced by a soft, ancient grinding sound, like two heavy rocks shifting against each other. She pushed the manual lock lever, but it felt solid, jammed, turning the car into a perfectly sealed cage of dark steel and glass. "You don't leave the conversation when the foundation is still being poured," Victor said, his eyes now glittering with an unnatural intensity that matched the cracks on his nails. Panicked, Vanessa screamed, throwing her body against the passenger door. With a desperate heave, she managed to shatter the window. Shards of safety glass rained down, slicing across her forearms and shoulders, but she scrambled through the jagged opening, landing hard on the pavement. She ran, not looking back, the deep, resonating sound of Victor's laughter ringing in her ears, a sound that seemed to come not from his throat, but from beneath the asphalt itself. The police officer who took her statement, Ryan, was compassionate but ultimately perplexed. They found the car, abandoned, but when they ran the VIN, It came back registered to a logistics company that had reported it stolen 3 years prior. "We have no record of a Victor Hale, Miss Calloway," Officer Ryan confirmed later, his voice professional and final. "No license, no social security number, nothing. He's a ghost." When Vanessa called Eliza, her friend sounded genuinely confused. "Victor? Who are you talking about, V? I haven't set you up with anyone recently. Are those cuts serious?" Eliza sounded utterly convinced, leaving Vanessa isolated in her own terrifying reality. Victor had been seamlessly erased from existence, except in the library. Vanessa returned to work, desperate for routine, but the Franklin Park branch was no longer a refuge. It was an accomplice. The hum from her date followed her, vibrating the light fixtures in the reading room. When she shelved books in the 700s, the biography section, 920s, would suddenly groan and books would fly off the shelves, scattering to reveal words spelled out on the carpet in their spines. "You belong. You are mine." Officer Ryan, seeing her escalating distress and the physical evidence of her wounds, started taking the case seriously, going off record to check city records. But Victor's influence had already spread beyond the personal. Walking down High Street, Vanessa began noticing the stone cracks. Not normal wear and tear, but jagged, spiderweb fissures appearing across the city, on the facade of City Hall, in the retaining walls of the State House, even across the polished granite floor of the library lobby. The cracks pulsed with that same low hum. One day, while waiting at a bus stop, Vanessa caught her reflection in a large plate glass window of a bakery. She saw herself, pale and scarred, looking over her shoulder. Standing behind her reflection, his hands pressed flat against the glass, was Victor. He was smiling wide, his fractured fingernails appearing to chip the very surface of the glass from the inside. She turned instantly, but the street was empty. The reflections became constant. Every polished surface, a metal spoon, a dark phone screen, a puddle, showed the city behind her, and Victor standing in the city, an immovable part of its architecture, waiting patiently. She realized the first date hadn't just been a horrific encounter, it had been a doorway. Victor was the embodied consciousness of the city's stone, claiming the people who lacked strong roots. Vanessa could no longer escape the feeling of being pulled back into the earth, her memory and substance merging with the foundation of Columbus. She was trapped in an endless cycle where the city itself and its ancient warden, Victor, claimed her through the spreading stone, the whispering books, and the constant, terrifying presence in every reflection. The date was over, but her haunting, her new permanent residency within the cold, unforgiving memory of the city, had just begun. Claire Sutton, 23, and comfortably hidden within the towering stacks of used books at Red Fern's bookshop and cafe in Asheville, North Carolina, was perpetually anchored by memory. Her life, 5 years after her father's sudden death, was a study in quiet routine, a protective shell she rarely allowed anyone to penetrate. It was her colleague, Lewis, who finally convinced her to try a dating app, leading to a date with a man named Mason Wilder. Mason was waiting for her in the cafe section, a man with deep-set, serious eyes and an air of gentle melancholy that Claire recognized instantly. He was ruggedly handsome, wearing a dark sweater that seemed to absorb the cafe's warm, amber light. Their conversation started innocuously enough, focused on obscure literature and mountain trails. Claire felt a pull toward him, a connection deeper than mere surface compatibility. But the shift came swiftly and violently, cutting through her fragile calm like broken glass. "You miss the routine, don't you?" Mason said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that felt too intimate for a first meeting. The Saturday morning trips to the hardware store. The smell of sawdust and stale coffee. Claire froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. She hadn't mentioned her father, not even vaguely. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, feeling the blood drain from her face. Mason's eyes were steady, entirely sympathetic. Your father, Arthur, the carpenter. You were with him when he collapsed in the workshop, weren't you? You still smell the wood polish sometimes, don't you? The specificity was a punch to the gut. No one knew that. Not Lewis, not even her closest friends. Claire had been only 18 when Arthur Sutton died suddenly of an aneurysm while working on a new birdhouse, and the memory of the workshop, the smell, the dust, the horrifying silence after the crash, was her most closely guarded scar. How do you know that? She whispered, the cafe noise suddenly muted. Mason looked genuinely troubled. It's just, I feel things, Claire. Connections. Places where grief is locked down. I felt it radiating off you when I walked in. He paused, then stood abruptly. I need to go. Right now. Before Claire could process his sudden departure. He was out the door and into the darkening Asheville street. She followed him onto the pavement, watching him unlock a large, charcoal gray sedan parked under a sputtering street lamp. As he opened the driver's side door, a flash of light from the lamp revealed the interior. The upholstery, the dashboard, the floor mats. They were soaked, glistening as if the car had just been submerged in a torrential downpour, despite the dry, crisp evening air. Mason slid into the seat, the water instantly absorbing into his dark clothes, and the car sped away, leaving no damp patch on the asphalt, only the acrid smell of ozone and wet earth. Mason Wilder had vanished, taking all the moisture with him. Claire spent the night in a state of terror, the memory of the wet car interior a sickening counterpoint to Mason's unnerving knowledge. The next morning, the terror intensified, becoming intensely personal. On her kitchen counter, sitting next to her coffee maker, was a small, perfectly round, chipped agate marble. Claire hadn't seen that marble since she was 7, when she had accidentally knocked it into the ancient, rusted drain pipe behind the garage. She knew for a fact it was buried beneath 30 feet of silt. Later that week, she found her father's pocket knife. It was the heavy, brass-handled knife he always carried, the one she had tearfully buried beneath the old oak tree the day after his funeral, convinced it was the only way to keep a part of him safe. Now it was lying open on her bedside table, the blade catching the moonlight. The most horrifying discovery was the final relic, a thick, velvet hair ribbon, dark blue, that her mother had cut from her hair and placed in the casket just before the lid closed. It was tied to the doorknob of her bedroom closet, gently swaying in a draft that didn't exist. Mason hadn't just known her history. He was unearthing it, bringing relics of her deepest grief back to the surface. Desperate, Claire went to the police, speaking with Detective Harris, a kind but world-weary man. He patiently listened to her story about the psychic date, the soaked car, and the reappearing treasures. Miss Sutton, with respect, there's no evidence of a crime here, Harris concluded, filing the report under psychological distress. We can't investigate a missing person if we can't prove the person existed outside of a dating app. But the haunting didn't stop. The books at Red Ferns began to whisper. When she was alone, the lights above the cash register would hum in that familiar, oppressive way. The relics continued to shift around her apartment, mocking her security. More terrifyingly, she began to hear voices. Sometimes she would hear Mason's low, hypnotic baritone whispering her name, followed instantly by the soft, familiar voice of her father, Arthur, speaking together, their tones merging into one unified, possessive sound. We understand you, Claire. We know what you buried. The cafe section became unbearable. One evening, she saw a figure standing behind the counter, a man in a waiter's uniform she didn't recognize. His apron was stained brown, and his head was cocked at an unnatural angle. He didn't move or speak, but his eyes were wide, fixed on Claire, and he desperately, silently, shook his head, a warning from the dead, a soul lost to whatever entity Mason served. Claire realized Mason wasn't just a man. He was a collector of grief, a siren who used the deep, abiding ache of loneliness as his lure. He offered to fill the void left by her father's death with something eternal, something that would keep her loved ones close, even if they were terrifying relics. She sat motionless in her living room, staring at the front door. The loneliness she had guarded against for years now felt like a crushing physical weight, heavier than all the earth Mason had dug up. Then, she heard the engine. Outside her apartment window, bathed in the sickly yellow light of the parking lot, was the charcoal gray sedan. It looked dry now, its surface smooth and menacing. The passenger side window was rolled down a fraction of an inch. From the dark confines of the back seat, the single, hypnotic voice of Mason, layered with the comforting, paternal resonance of Arthur, cut through the night. "Get in, Claire. You will never be alone again." Claire felt her fear buckle under the sudden, agonizing pressure of her profound need for connection. She knew she should call the police, scream, or run. But the hand resting on her doorknob felt strangely warm, and the prospect of never feeling lonely again, even if it meant eternal damnation with a monster and her own morbid memories, was an unbearable temptation. Her hand gripped the knob tighter. The horror wasn't Mason's power. It was the terrifying realization that part of her, the wounded, lonely part, desperately wanted to obey. Emily Carter, at 24, was tired of sterile coffee shops and crowded bars. She was a nursing student, her life a monotonous loop of textbooks and hospital shifts, and her persistent loneliness felt like a low-grade fever she couldn't shake. For her first date with Derek Lawson, a connection made through a mutual friend, Ethan, she suggested something different, an old-school roadside spot called the Griddle, tucked away 20 miles outside the sprawl of Detroit's lights. Derek, who was vaguely handsome with distant blue eyes and a quiet disposition, had readily agreed to the unusual venue in the late hour. When Emily pulled into the crumbling, poorly lit parking lot around 9:30 p.m., the diner's neon sign flickered, casting a sickly green and pink glow onto the cracked asphalt. It was exactly the kind of isolated, time-forgotten place Emily craved for a change of pace, a place where time seemed to slow down. Derek was already inside, seated in a booth upholstered in worn red vinyl. He stood when she approached, a polite gesture that felt automated rather than warm. The diner was busy, perhaps too busy for such a late hour in such a remote location. A dozen patrons, mostly older couples and solitary figures nursing coffee, filled the counter seats and other booths. The air was thick with the smell of old grease and cheap detergent, and the fluorescent tubes above buzzed with an unnerving intensity. Emily noticed the silence almost immediately. It wasn't just quiet, it was an active absence of sound. No one spoke, no glasses clinked loudly, and the jukebox was silent. Most disturbingly, every single person in the diner, from the grizzled countercook wiping the griddle to the couple seated in the next booth, was staring at her. Not in a curious, passing way, but with an intense, unblinking focus that made the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Their expressions, if they could be called that, were faint, fixed, and utterly vacant, like poorly preserved museum exhibits, each one wearing a terrifyingly subtle smile. "So, Derek," Emily began, trying to break the heavy, suffocating silence as the waitress, a woman with unnaturally smooth, pale skin, dropped 2 sticky menus onto the table. I love this place. It feels like stepping back in time. I bet it has stories. Derek, however, barely contributed. He kept his gaze fixed on the plastic-coated menu, almost studying it. "It does," he agreed, his voice flat and thin, his gaze never lifting to meet hers. He answered her questions about his job, something vaguely in logistics, and his interests, reading, but his responses were short, detached, and utterly lacking in human warmth. He ate his burger with methodical, detached movements, never commenting on the food or the bizarre atmosphere. The entire time, Emily could feel the collective gaze of the diner patrons pressing against her back, making her want to fidget, to yell, to ask them what they were looking at. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. The man at the counter, who looked like a retired accountant named Robert, had his eyes locked on her, his faint smile stretching unnaturally wide. She quickly turned back, realizing that Derek wasn't a companion. He was just a shield, and a very flimsy one at that, absorbing none of the communal, hostile focus. The atmosphere was a physical weight, crushing the possibility of a normal date. After 20 minutes of this excruciating silence and suffocating observation, Emily needed an escape. "I need to use the ladies' room," she mumbled, pushing herself out of the booth. The moment she stood, the collective staring intensified, following her across the cracked linoleum floor like synchronized headlights. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. The restroom was small and dimly lit, smelling faintly of cheap pine cleaner and old damp. As she splashed cold water on her face, trying to calm her violently racing heart, she heard muffled voices just outside the thin wood door. It was the 2 waitresses and the cook. "She's finally here." The cook's deep voice hissed, sounding like metal grinding against stone. "A little late, perhaps, but she came, didn't she?" The first waitress whispered, a dry, papery sound that scraped against the door. Then the second waitress, the one with the pale, ageless skin, spoke, her tone one of chilling, quiet satisfaction. "It's Emily. We thought she'd forgotten the way, forgotten her duty. The cycle is complete." Emily's blood turned to ice. She hadn't introduced herself to anyone, certainly not to the staff. Her name, Emily Carter, was a secret shared only between her, Derek, and the forgotten dating app profile. The agonizing realization that they knew her name, that they were expecting her, waiting for her, snapped her anxiety into full-blown animal panic. This wasn't a diner, it was a gathering. She was the unwilling reason that they were all there, the final piece in a silent, static tableau. Throwing the door open, Emily stumbled back into the main dining area. The fluorescent light above the counter seemed to flicker and die slightly, and the awful smell of old grease thickened, becoming cloyingly sweet, like perfume worn by a corpse. She stopped dead at the booth. Derek Lawson was gone. His dark, nondescript coat was still draped over the back of the seat, his half-eaten burger still on the plate, but the space where he had been seated was empty, the worn red vinyl smooth and undisturbed. The waitresses were standing exactly where she left them, their hands frozen mid-motion, wiping down the counter. Every single customer was frozen in their seat, mid-sip, mid-bite, their heads unnaturally angled toward her, their fixed smiles unwavering. Their dark, vacant eyes followed her every move. They were no longer staring, they were welcoming. A heavy, folded square of paper had been placed precisely where Derek's hand had rested. It was the bill. Emily snatched it up, her fingers trembling so violently she almost tore the paper. The handwritten total was $0. Instead, scrawled across the receipt in thick, aggressive, black ink were 5 words that sealed her fate and dissolved her reality. "Welcome home, Emily. We've been waiting." A silent, communal sigh, like air escaping a sealed crypt or 100 people inhaling in perfect unison, filled the diner. The fixed smiles on every face seemed to widen by an imperceptible fraction. Emily screamed, a choked, wet sound scrambling out of the booth and dropping the horrifying bill onto the floor. She didn't look back at the fixed, eternal smiles of her new family. She burst through the heavy metal exit door, the metal slamming shut behind her with a sound like a guillotine blade. She reached her car, fumbling the key into the ignition, and tore out of the lot, headlights cutting through the oppressive, unyielding darkness. She sped down the desolate roadside for a good 2 miles before daring to glance in her rearview mirror. The space where the griddle had stood was now nothing but a dense, lightless patch of woods, utterly unmarked. The old roadside diner, her dreadful destination, was gone, having delivered its package and vanished into the night, leaving only the sound of the rain and the horrifying certainty that she had been claimed. Derek Lawson was a phantom, and her loneliness, now replaced by eternal, terrifying company, was a thing of the past. Emily would never be lonely again. Jason Miller, 29, worked in IT, a clean, predictable world of fiber optics and organized data. He liked control, which was perhaps why his blind date with Laura Perkins felt so jarringly off-script. The date, set in a trendy, noisy Italian place in Midtown Manhattan, had been fine. Awkward silences punctuated by strained laughter, the usual first date choreography. Laura, a petite woman with strikingly pale skin and dark, depthless eyes, had been the one constant source of unease. She spoke little, offering sharp, cryptic observations about the city that made Jason feel like a newly arrived tourist. It was nearly midnight when the check arrived. Jason suggested an Uber, wanting the familiar safety of a tracked, rated driver. Laura shook her head, her dark hair swinging like heavy silk. "No, we take a cab," she insisted, her voice dropping, laced with an unfamiliar authority. "You need to see the ride home, Jason. It's important." Before Jason could protest, she was pulling him outside onto the curb of 53rd Street. Almost instantly, a yellow cab materialized, gliding to a stop as if summoned by thought rather than hailed by hand. It was an older model, the paint dull, the back seat smelling faintly of stale cigarette smoke and ozone. The driver was already seated. He was a large man, bundled in a dark coat, his cap pulled low enough to obscure his features in the faint street light. The plastic partition separating them was scratched and yellowed. Laura slid in first, leaning back with a sigh that suggested deep, profound exhaustion. Jason slid in beside her, pulling the heavy door shut. "Where to?" The driver's voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection or accent. "West Village," Laura instructed, giving Jason's address. The cab pulled away with a violent jerk that snapped Jason's head back. He leaned forward to check the meter, a habit ingrained from years of city living. The familiar red LED numbers glowed faintly through the grime of the partition. The meter was running, but not forward. It displayed $27.50, then $27.45, then $27.30. It was counting backward, the cents draining away instead of accumulating. Jason blinked, convinced the jarring start had affected his vision. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. The number continued its slow, steady descent. Is your meter broken?" Jason asked, leaning closer to the partition, trying to address the driver. The driver remained silent, his massive shoulders hunched over the wheel. "It's not broken," Laura said softly from beside him, her voice startlingly close. "It's just taking you where you belong, Jason. The charge is already paid." Jason dismissed it as a bizarre, slightly alarming quirk, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Right, paid in advance. Very futuristic." He tried to look out the side window to ground himself in the familiar chaos of Manhattan. But the outside was wrong. They should have been passing the dazzling theater marquees of Times Square, the throngs of tourists, the relentless traffic. Instead, the streets were empty. Not just quiet, but deserted. The skyscrapers stood like silent, gray monoliths, their ground floor windows boarded up with splintered plywood or covered in a thick, creeping layer of dust. The vibrant advertisements were faded to illegible ghosts of color. There was no noise, no sirens, no horns, no distant shouts, just the low, mechanical drone of the cab's engine and the faint tick-tick-tick of the backward-running meter. "Where are we?" Jason whispered, pressing his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass. "This isn't Manhattan. This looks abandoned. The city was a corpse, a decaying monument to a forgotten age. The buildings were still standing, but the life, the light, the energy, the people had been meticulously scrubbed away. The decay felt deeper than mere neglect. It felt intentional, curated." Laura reached out and placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was ice cold, and Jason recoiled slightly. "It is Manhattan, Jason," she said, her voice a low, chilling melody. "Just the one you built, the one you left." Panic began to constrict his chest. He fumbled for his phone to take a picture, to call someone, anyone, but the screen was dark, showing no signal, just a static image of a clock face where the hand spun rapidly counterclockwise. "I've never been here before," Jason insisted, trying to sound firm, but his voice cracked with fear. "I just moved to the West Village last year. I don't know this place." Laura leaned into him, her lips almost touching his ear, and the smell of ozone, that same strange smell from the taxi, was strong on her breath. "I told you you'd come back." Her whisper wasn't a warning or a question. It was a simple, factual statement, the absolute certainty of a prophecy fulfilled. It implied they had known each other before, that this desolate version of the city was familiar to him, and that this date had never been about meeting someone new, but about returning to something old and dreadful. A sickening thought rooted itself in Jason's mind. What if the meter counting backward wasn't just counting distance, but time? What if he wasn't going home, but back to the place where he truly belonged, a place that predated his current life? "Who are you, Laura?" he demanded, trying to pull the door handle, but the lock was solid, fused with the frame. Laura didn't answer. She only smiled, that quiet, fixed smile that held no joy, only infinite knowledge. Jason frantically searched for the driver's eyes in the rearview mirror, desperate for a human connection, an ally in this nightmare. As their eyes finally met in the dusty, cracked glass, the horror reached its absolute zenith. The face staring back at Jason from beneath the brim of the dark cap was not that of a strange, hunched taxi driver. It was Jason Miller, a terrifyingly hollow version of himself, but undeniably him. The same wide, light blue eyes, the same sharp jawline, the same faint scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood fall. But this version was spectral, a dead mask of his own features, his eyes possessing a terrifying, ancient sadness. The driver, Jason, looked at the man in the back seat with chilling recognition, a look that said, "Welcome back to your true self." The meter finally hit zero. $0. The cab screeched to a halt in front of a completely unrecognizable brownstone, its windows shattered, a thicket of dead vines choking the entrance. Jason realized the ride was over. He was trapped in the shell of a city he was meant to inhabit, driven there by the specter of his own identity and accompanied by a woman who waited patiently for his return. He was home, but home was the grave of his former life. Hannah Brooks, a history teacher whose life had settled into the comforting routine of curriculum planning and afternoon tea, felt an uncharacteristic tremor of excitement. At 26, she'd been hesitant to wade back into the dating pool, but Ryan Green had been surprisingly persuasive. He was charmingly nerdy, with kind, crinkling eyes and a dry wit. He didn't suggest a stuffy dinner. Instead, he proposed a midnight showing of a classic, obscure horror film at the Gallows Hill Cinema in Salem, Massachusetts, a town already steeped in the kind of dark history Hannah usually taught, not experienced. She met Ryan outside the cinema's faded marquee. The air was crisp, carrying the salty tang of the Atlantic and a faint, cloying smell of popcorn. The theater was a small, independent place, all sticky carpet and peeling paint, perfectly suited for a late-night cult viewing. "I managed to get tickets for the Witch's Lament screening," Ryan said, adjusting his glasses and smiling. "It's a truly awful B-movie, but the atmosphere makes it perfect." They stepped inside. The lobby was empty, the concession stand dark. An elderly man with a perpetually bored expression took their tickets without a word, his gaze fixed somewhere past Hannah's shoulder. When they entered Auditorium 3, Hannah paused, a nervous laugh catching in her throat. "I guess the turnout is a little low," she remarked, looking around the tiered seating. Ryan shrugged, his cheerfulness unwavering. "It's midnight, and it's a 20-year-old movie nobody remembers. Just think of it as a private showing. Best seats are in the center, halfway up." They chose their seats. The auditorium was vast and silent, the velvet seats absorbing all light and sound. The silence was the first truly unsettling thing. It was a cavernous, expectant quiet, not the usual pre-movie buzz of whispers and rustling bags. Hannah could hear the frantic thump of her own pulse. The lights dimmed, not with a smooth transition, but with a harsh snap, plunging the room into absolute darkness save for the brilliant square of the screen. The film began. It was exactly as Ryan described. Low budget, gothic and filled with overly dramatic screams and cheap fog effects. Hannah tried to relax, focusing on the stylized horror unfolding on screen, but the profound sense of isolation gnawed at her. She reached out and felt Ryan's hand, his skin warm and solid, a necessary anchor in the echoing void. About 30 minutes into the film, during a scene where the villain was stalking a woman through a fog-choked graveyard, the projected image suddenly stuttered, froze, and dissolved into static. The loud, buzzing sound made Hannah jump. "Technical difficulties, I guess," Ryan whispered, squeezing her hand. Then, the static cleared. The image that replaced the gothic film was crystal clear, stark, and horrifyingly familiar. The camera was positioned just inside the lobby entrance of the Gallows Hill Cinema. It was a grainy, security-style feed, but unmistakable. Hannah saw the elderly ticket taker with the bored expression. Then, the double doors opened. On screen, Hannah Brooks entered the cinema. She was wearing the exact same clothes, the dark denim jacket, the green scarf, and her expression on the screen was one of nervous anticipation. She watched, paralyzed, as her on-screen self approached the ticket booth, purchased the ticket, and then turned to enter the auditorium. "Ryan," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this? Is this some sort of gimmick?" Ryan remained silent, his grip on her hand tightening painfully. The film continued to play out her recent past, with unsettling fidelity. On screen, Hannah sat down in the very seat she was currently occupying. The camera must have been inside the auditorium, hidden somewhere in the upper rows. The angle was disconcerting, a silent, perpetual observer. She watched her on-screen self turn her head, glancing left at the empty seat where Ryan should have been before the film she was watching in the film started. The on-screen version of Hannah settled in, looking forward, completely unaware she was being recorded, unaware she was being watched by her real self. The real Hannah felt a wave of dizzying nausea. This wasn't a film. It was a captured memory, a loop of her own arrival, and the awareness that she had been alone from the start slammed into her. The film sped up, showing her on-screen self watching the fake gothic horror for several more minutes, the hours collapsing in fast-forward. The camera zoomed in on her face, revealing the minute shifts of her expression, the growing anxiety. The film wasn't showing the movie she had paid for. It was showing her. Then, the final, agonizing sequence began. The image on the screen darkened slightly. The projector word, sounding like a high-pitched, mocking giggle. The screen Hannah watched was no longer a recording of her arrival. It was a live prediction. Her on-screen self suddenly felt a shift in the air, exactly where the real Hannah was sitting. The on-screen Hannah turned her head toward the seat next to her, where Ryan should be, but the seat was, and always had been, empty. On the screen, her own face contorted into an expression of raw, unadulterated terror. Then the camera angle violently shifted to a close-up fixed on the on-screen Hannah. The horrifying death began in gruesome, unflinching detail. A shadow, impossibly dark, shaped like a reaching hand and yet formless, coiled out from the fabric of the empty velvet seat next to her, wrapping around the cinematic version of her neck. The cinematic scream was silent, but her on-screen struggle was visceral, graphic, and drawn out. Her hands clawed uselessly at the shadow before she was violently pulled backward into the abyss of the chair, her body thrashing as the image focused on her eyes that went wide with recognition and then glazed over with finality. The screen immediately went dark. The real Hannah gasped, tearing her hand from Ryan's. She whipped her head around, adrenaline flooding her system. Ryan Green's seat was empty. The dent in the velvet where he had sat was still warm, but he was gone. There was no coat, no glasses, no lingering scent. She was utterly alone in the colossal, echoing blackness of the auditorium. Then she heard it. It wasn't coming from the silent screen or the dark corners of the room. It was coming from the speakers mounted high on the walls, surrounding her in a 360-degree oral assault. It was laughter, not a kind, nervous chuckle, but a high-pitched, maniacal, echoing sound like 1,000 people laughing at the most beautiful joke ever told. And through the chorus of chilling mirth, she recognized a single, distinct timbre, Ryan's voice, ringing out with triumph and utter cruelty. She fled, scrambling over the seats in a blind panic, clawing her way toward the exit door, the maniacal, surrounding laughter intensifying with every step. She burst into the empty, darkened lobby, ran past the vacant concession stand, and slammed out the main doors. As she collapsed onto the pavement outside, gulping the night air, she looked up at the marquee. The title still glowed, The Witch's Lament, but underneath, across the smaller bulbs, a new message flashed in sporadic, stuttering light, perfectly timed with the fading, distant laughter now trapped only in her head. Hannah Brooks. Premiere showing. She had been the horror, the feature presentation, and the audience all along. The laughter was her review.